All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming this afternoon to help us launch Chuck's new book. Now, I guess I should say I'm Joanna Lewis. For those of you who don't know me, I'm now directing the Science, Technology, and International Affairs program here at Georgetown in the School of Foreign Service. I started here 13 years ago or so, back when Chuck was leading the program. And while we miss him, we're very grateful he's still around and doing events like this for us. And we're very excited to hear about his new book, The Survival Nexus, Science, Technology, and World Affairs. Just very briefly, I'm sure Chuck needs no introduction with this group, who many of you I know have known him for a very long time. But he was the Distinguished Professor of Science, Technology, and International Affairs here at Georgetown from 1997 to 2014. He also served as the director of this program between 1997 and 2006. He was the first science and technology advisor to the World Bank, serving in that position from 1971 to 1986. And of course, he also has spent time at Princeton, where he was visiting lecturer. And I'm sure I've missed many, many things about Chuck's distinguished career. But we are really grateful that you all could join us here this afternoon. And I'm sorry that we couldn't do this in person, but it's great actually to do it virtually. We can have people from all over the country, maybe all over the world, joining us for this. So thank you all so much. And the plan is I'm going to turn it over to Chuck to tell us about his book, and then we'll open it up for Q&A and discussion and wrap up about an hour from now. So with that, Chuck, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Joanna. It's great to see you. It's great to see everybody in this group. A lot of old friends and a couple of cousins I haven't seen in a long time, which is neat. It's great to be back at Georgetown, even if it's only virtually. And it's great to see that STIA is still thriving under Joanna's able leadership. We've had 40 years under 7 different directors. I think some of them are here today. As far as I know, it's still a unique undergraduate program in the country, although Joanna probably knows better than I. So first, I want to thank Joanna and the STIA program for their support and for the opportunity to launch my book. I thank also in the Georgetown community, Carol Sargent. She introduced me to the mysteries of the book publishing business and started me on the path toward writing for a general audience, and other STIA faculty, Emily, Bernard, Rebecca, and Raj, for their help with different parts of the book. So the book deals with the interweaving of science, technology, and world affairs in critical global issues. That's the overall subject. It's intended for a general audience, but it should be usable as a text or a reading for an academic course. It covers climate change, energy, pandemics, global health, nuclear weapons, cybersecurity, internet freedom, competitiveness and employment in advanced manufacturing, poverty and hunger, the challenge to democracy from techno-authoritarianism and disinformation, and the issues surrounding newer technologies like gene drivers, autonomous weapons, artificial intelligence, and geoengineering, all against the background of globalization, the rise of China, and the resurgence of Russia. It includes brief explanations of the science and technology underlying each issue and definitions of important social science concepts. You may have already observed that this is not a small menu. I chose these subjects because they are among the most critical issues of the century. They are centered on science and technology, and because each of them shows a different way in which science and technology are woven into the broader context of politics, economics, business, finance, law, culture, and popular psychology. The point is that these links are central to these issues and many others of the great issues of the century. I learned a lot while I was writing this book. Science and technology have made it possible for people to enjoy longer, richer, healthier lives, but they also pose existential threats to human survival. These dangers are real, they affect everyone, they know no borders, and they demand our attention. The more I learned, the more I became alarmed that the intersection of science and technology with international affairs is taking the world into dangerous and unexplored territory. Climate change, pandemics, gene drivers, autonomous weapons, and especially nuclear weapons. Any of these can get out of hand with catastrophic consequences. They can be managed, but time is growing short. We're playing with fire. In fact, we're playing with several kinds of fire all at the same time. That's why I call science, technology, and world affairs the survival nexus. Bit of shameless commerce there. This is also the message of the doomsday clock of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, with which Rob Sokolow is intimately involved. It's now set at 100 seconds before midnight, and part of the message of the Elders, which is a distinguished group founded by Nelson Mandela that now includes such international luminaries as Ban Ki-moon, Gro Harlem Brundtland, Mary Robinson, and Desmond Tutu. Well, the book has a few amusing incidents in between the serious moments. Did you know, for example, that Albert Einstein's famous letter to President Franklin Roosevelt urging him to develop the atomic bomb almost didn't get delivered to Einstein for his signature? Leo Szilard, the author of the letter, didn't know where Einstein's summer home was on Long Island, and he was about to turn back and go home when a small boy directed him to the house where Einstein lived. See how small coincidences have big historical effects. Well, the COVID epidemic is showing the world the importance of the mix of science and technology with politics, business, and popular psychology. The bottom line is that science and technology are not enough by themselves. We all know this story. The scientific community reacted quickly to the pandemic. As soon as it became apparent that infected people could spread infection before they showed symptoms, epidemiologists recommended drastic social distancing to prevent hospitals from being overwhelmed by desperately ill patients. In only a year from the beginning of the epidemic, scientists and pharmaceutical companies from many countries, building on 20 years of government-funded basic research on related coronaviruses, succeeded in developing numerous effective vaccines, many of them based on new messenger RNA technology. In this, they were incentivized by the public health crisis, by the scientific challenge, and by Operation Warp Speed, a US government guarantee that it would purchase large quantities of any promising vaccine, whether or not it passed final tests of effectiveness and efficiency. The idea was to shorten the time from invention to manufacturing scale up, even if some of the vaccines to be purchased turned out to be ineffective and had to be discarded. But the vaccines and the epidemiological recommendations faced unexpected political obstacles that are still in the morning paper this morning. The need for social distancing forced a worldwide economic shutdown. Political leaders in many countries ignored or squelched the warnings of scientific experts. They downplayed the seriousness of the virus. They covered up the spread of infection. They hawked ineffective remedies. In so doing, they squandered critical time that could have been used to save millions of lives, not to mention trillions of dollars. The World Health Organization was caught up in the US presidential election campaign and in the geopolitical and trade crossfire between the US and China, fed rampant misinformation, millions delayed or refused vaccination, creating the conditions for increasingly infectious variants like Delta and maybe Omicron to evolve. The international response to climate change has been similarly disappointing, again because of the tensions between science and technology and their broader context. There was once reason to hope that the successful effort to reverse the damage to the stratospheric ozone layer would provide a template for a similar campaign to mitigate and adapt to global warming. But climate has proved to be very much more challenging than ozone, and the world now has a very few years to put in place changes that would have been much easier and cheaper decades ago. Electrification of transport and of industries with renewable sources of energy is central to reducing CO2 emissions. And technological innovation has brought down the costs of wind and solar energy. But a strong contribution from decentralized wind and solar would require major changes in the infrastructure and the business models of electric utilities. And that's just the first of the many policy and institutional changes needed if any reasonable target for climate mitigation is to be met. The risks of pandemics and climate disruption pale before those of nuclear war, which can wipe out millions of lives in just a few minutes and possibly bring an end to civilization. We've hadn't had a nuclear war for 75 years, so the prospect has receded from public consciousness. My students used to think of it as a grandparents' issue. On the contrary, nuclear war is still an existential threat. There's little left of the nuclear arms control regime that was painstakingly put together over more than 30 years, based on the idea that the world would be safer if there were fewer weapons of mass destruction. The regime has protected us from nuclear war, aided by a good deal of luck. It needs strengthening and updating, in large part because of the need to control new technology. Here it's worth remembering that we owe our lives to two Soviet military officers. First, Colonel Stanislav Petrov, who realized that the signal he had received of a US missile attack in 1983 was a false alarm. And second, Submarine Chief of Staff Vasily Arkhipov, who refused permission to a Soviet submarine commander who wanted to launch a nuclear missile at the US at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Both Petrov and Vasilyev saved us from all-out nuclear war. Close. The bad news is that, the good news is that the nuclear taboo and the ban on nuclear tests still hold, except for North Korea. I missed 3 lines of my talk. We're down a long way from the 30,000 or so nuclear weapons that the US and the USSR had at the height of the Cold War. The bad news is that hundreds of missiles in the US and in Russia are still on hair trigger alert, ready to be launched on warning, whether true or false, of an incoming attack. What is more, China is building up its nuclear capability, and its foreign policy is increasingly aggressive. Unlike the US and the Soviets during the Cold War, China does not have a long history of collaborative research and tough discussions on arms control, nor has it the experience with near misses that forced the US and the USSR to come to a shared understanding of the requirements for nuclear stability. In a new development, several powers are developing hypersonic missiles that greatly increase the risk of accidental nuclear war, in a classic case of failure to control the march of technology. In sum, the world is setting up an unstable situation in which a confrontation between nuclear powers can quickly get out of hand. We urgently need updated arms control agreements that take into account newly empowered nuclear powers, new technology, and new weapons systems. And this requires frank and serious discussions among hostile and distrustful governments and militaries, as well as collaboration among researchers from both allies and potential adversaries. The information age has given rise to a new set of global issues. Of these, the most ominous is the danger that cyber warfare can quickly get out of control, since cyber weapons favor the first attacker, and the response to a strategic cyber attack on critical infrastructure by a major cyber power is likely to be a strategic counterattack a fraction of a second later. This can escalate to virtually instantaneous cyber apocalypse. All advanced countries have an interest in establishing a regime that would avoid such instant destruction of critical infrastructure. But arms control for cyber warfare faces more difficult obstacles than nuclear arms control, in part for technical reasons. It's hard to determine the purpose of a cyber attack. It's slow, identifying its source is slow and difficult, and it's hard to detect violations of any, it would be hard to detect violations of any possible arms limitation agreement. It's an urgent need for research and discussions involving both natural and social scientists from both allies and potential adversaries to see whether these obstacles can be overcome. North Korea poses additional problems since it has plenty of cyber warfare capability and little cyber infrastructure to be destroyed in a counterattack. Cyber arms control also raises difficult political problems. Cyber technology embodies values of freedom of speech, information, and innovation. These are human rights to us, but to authoritarian governments, they are security threats. As a result, there's a serious disagreement on the very definition of the word cybersecurity. At the same time, all major powers have an interest in avoiding a cyber apocalypse. We need a technical system that will at least prevent accidental cyber war, as well as prevent attacks on political leadership, nuclear command and control, and key infrastructure like hospitals or irrigation systems. We also need to install speed brakes on possible actions and reactions to attack. Sorting out these issues will take a lot of research and a lot of negotiation. Alongside the issues of cybersecurity is a technical, economic, and political competition between Western democracy and the techno-authoritarian model of China and Russia. Here, the immediate issue is the future of the internet. In the early days, enthusiasts predicted that authoritarian governments would find it technically impossible to control the flow of information from the outside world. The assumption was that there was no way to block information on democracy, freedom of religion, and protests against dictatorship, and still receive technical and market information and allow non-political conversation about sports and dating. Well, didn't last. Authoritarian countries not only mastered the internet and social media after their initial blunders, but they transformed them into tools like the Great Firewall of China for control of information flows, and into technology for the comprehensive surveillance and suppression of political opponents and ethnic minorities. These tools became the basis for a system of techno-authoritarianism that makes possible both efficient municipal administration. It's a great way to direct traffic, to control crime, to enforce a pandemic lockdown, but also to control oppressed minorities like the Uyghurs. The Chinese are doing their best to export this system to like-minded countries as an alternative to Western ideas of democracy and freedom of information. We're well on the way to a splinter net, a global network half free and half controlled by repressive governments. At the same time, Russia is using a broad array of communications technology to undermine Western democracies and alliances by influencing elections, by spreading disinformation and conspiracy theories like Pizzagate that's cast doubt on the very idea of objective truth. These developments are serious threats to democracies worldwide, and they're a far cry from the intention of the original inventors of the internet and the World Wide Web. Well, what do all these disparate subjects have in common? Science and technology are essential dimensions of all of them, but science and technology are not autonomous juggernauts. Their evolution and their impact depend on a complex tangle of politics, economics, finance, business, law, culture, and popular psychology. These links are subject to human decision and control. But left to themselves, these links can get us into serious trouble. Excuse me one moment. These links operate in many different ways. Technology, for example, responds to markets and to policy. Renewable energy has come down dramatically in price, but only a carbon price or tax will level the playing field and enable them to expand fast enough to meet any reasonable target for climate mitigation. Expanded electrification of transportation and other industries, combined with strong dependence on decentralized wind or solar, will require extensive reorganization of the electric power sector. Nuclear energy, which should be a useful tool, which should be in principle a useful tool in the mitigation of climate change, is prone to accidents due to capture of regulatory authorities by the nuclear industry or its promoters. Even funding for scientific research depends on public attitudes and awareness. Physics and engineering were emphasized during the Cold War, biology and medicine ever since. Research on climate change is particularly vulnerable to political currents. Global issues like nuclear and cyber arms control demand global responses. Ideally, these would take the form of regimes underpinned by treaties and international organizations, or failing that, by agreed norms and codes of conduct. We need to strengthen the World Health Organization, which has been weakened and politicized for decades. We need regimes, or at least norms and codes of conduct, for cutting-edge technologies like gene drivers and geoengineering. A number of ethical issues cut across the many technologies I treat in the book. Geoengineering and gene drivers, for example, are technologies with great potential value, but even small-scale research and development on them carries risks, some known, some not known. Once these technologies are developed to the point of plausible efficiency, efficacy, there will be great pressure to put them into practice. A number of organizations have proposed norms and codes of conduct for the international management of these technologies, but none of these documents is yet specific enough to guide practical decision-making. Many of the technologies treated in the book also raise questions of technological justice. Who benefits from advances in technology? Who bears their costs and risks? The issue of climate change, for example, turns on the question of how much cost and inconvenience we are willing to accept in order to forestall future catastrophe and to ensure a better world, or at least one at least as good as the one we have for future generations. That's the basic issue of sustainability. Similarly, many issues of global health turn on the question of how much we are willing to do to ensure that science and technology address the special problems of the poor and disadvantaged. Most innovative new products are first marketed to high-end consumers who are willing to pay extra for the latest and the best. And then these new products gradually make their way down to cheaper products that most people can afford. But some requirements of the poor, say a malaria vaccine or a fly-proof latrine, say that 3 times fast, to cite 2 examples, require specific innovations for which there isn't any Cadillac. Developing them is an ethical imperative, but is not usually a profitable undertaking. Public-spirited intervention by a government or a private organization is typically necessary if such products are ever to come into widespread use. Happily, the first effective malaria vaccine, the product of 30 years of research, trial and error, has just been approved by the WHO and is being rolled out for delivery across Africa with the support of a collaboration of industry and nonprofit financing organizations. The issues we have explored in the book raise questions of governance that have become increasingly difficult as governments have become more and more reluctant to agree to binding commitments. This has made norms that define expected behavior and can be made the subject of public and international pressure increasingly important. In this spirit, I have proposed general norms for the international management of science and technology-intensive global issues. These can be adapted to specific situations and technologies. In brief, they are, in no particular order, respect for facts and evolving knowledge, surprising that this is controversial, equity and sustainability, avoiding harm and minimizing risk, inclusivity and transparency in decision-making, accountability, collaboration and cooperation, and finally, an obligation to add to knowledge and to develop needed technology. As far as I know, that's the first time that this has been proposed as an international norm. These proposed norms are a first stab, and I welcome suggestions and improvement. The issues we have discussed are all manageable, but we have to manage them, and time is getting short. Returning to STIA, one of my purposes in writing this book was to show that the subject of science, technology, and international affairs has sufficient importance, coherence, and intellectual structure to justify it as a recognized academic discipline. It's such a joy to see STIA expanding and starting at the graduate level after its success at the undergraduate level. I would like to see other colleges and universities establish similar programs, and I'm quite confident that Georgetown will be able to meet any competition that might result. Well, in conclusion, this is the book. It's The Survival Nexus, Science, Technology, and World Affairs. It's published by Oxford University Press. It's listed, by the way, as copyrighted in 2022 because it was released in October. I'm told that's the custom. List price $40, but you can get a 30% discount if you order from the Survival Nexus page on the Oxford academic website. And I sent Joanna, Professor Lewis, the URL. It's at the bottom of the text that I sent you. It's been a great pleasure meeting with you. I look forward to your comments and your questions, and I thank you very much. And I want to reiterate what a pleasure it is to see my friends on this occasion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Chuck, for that whirlwind overview of this book, which covers so many different topics, which are also important and the front of many of our minds, I think, in this really interesting time. I want to encourage everyone who's here to raise your hands or put questions in the chat, either way, and I will call on folks. And while I'm waiting for you all to think about your questions, I should say, by the way, that the raise hand is, you can do it with the reactions button at the bottom of Zoom, or you can just sort of flag in the chat that you have a question, and I'll call on you to ask your questions in turn. But to kick us off, Chuck, sort of starting with you end the book with these norms that you put forward, which I think are really thought-provoking. And one of them is cooperation and collaboration, should be central here. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, so obviously this is a topic I think about a lot with respect to China and the United States. And there's a lot of pushback against cooperative relationships in this era of competition, this era of, risks associated with technology cooperation. Could you talk a little bit more about sort of the political, or, just the politics of that in this day and age, and, whether it's regarding China or sort of other rising powers that the US sort of see as a threat, particularly in sort of technological predominance?
Well, I'm not sure I have know from your own experience. This is a tough issue of walking and chewing gum at the same time. The situation vis-a-vis China is quite different from the situation vis-a-vis Russia, as we all know. Russia was pretty well isolated. We knew who the enemy was, and the issue was how to manage conflict. China is tougher. It's well integrated into the global economy. We depend on it for all kinds of manufactured goods, and yet it's increasingly a strategic threat, and it has no history of thinking about these issues. So it becomes quite critical to establish a shared framework for this conflict, to establish such a framework with the Soviet Union took more than a decade. And the problem was not only on the Russian side, it was on our side as well. We had to come to terms with some rather difficult issues having to do with arms control, having to do with inspection, having to do with nuclear stability, having to do with detection of underground or nuclear blasts. All kinds of technical issues were thrashed out between Russian physicists and American physicists, Russian political scientists, American political scientists, and it took some time. All this against a background of hostility. Now, things with China are much more complicated, but we have no choice but to establish the same kind of shared framework. And I believe they're not trying to do this. But it's not so easy. But there are complications on both sides. But it's quite essential, and we have to do it. You have your own experiences with this.
No, great, thank you. I agree. It's a tricky.
And there's issues of commercial competition, of trade. There's all kinds of economic issues in addition to the political ones.
Great. Well, we have lots of questions coming up, so I'm going to go ahead and turn to the list, starting with William Kohlglaser.
Hi, Chuck. I have your book.
You're a
Thank
hero.
you. But but my question is, what makes you optimistic that we're going to be able to achieve the norms you've laid out, especially now that science, technology are moving so fast and global problems are evolving so quickly, and our decision systems reaching consensus seem like they take much longer than the way the problems are evolving. So why are you an optimist?
It's Bill, last summer, I got out I escaped an Oregon wildfire by about an hour and a half before it overtook my neighborhood. I think things like that are going to happen with sufficient frequency that finally people will get the idea. I don't see, that's a crazy bull case, but it's going to take a shock to get people to say, hey, we really have a problem. We really have a series of interconnected problems which are linked, which have in common this nexus between science and technology and everything else. What's remarkable actually is the number of lessons that the climate crisis has actually taught. When you go down the list, and there's a list of about 20 propositions in my climate chapter, of the things we've had to learn about the possibility of human effect on the global environment, of the way in which technology is affected by economics and politics, of all kinds of things which were not dreamed of 50 years ago. And people pretty much understand these things wherever they are on the political spectrum. The problem, as you say, is that we're really running out of time, and the political currents seem to be going in the wrong direction. So I'm hoping that the younger generation will sit on us oldsters and say, "Hey, man, we really have to do something about it," because that's the major hope.
Great, thank you. Charles Perrin.
Yeah.
Hey, Charlie, how are you?
Hello. We've got to turn that off. There's an echo.
Yeah, do you have two connections open or?
Yeah. Okay, that's better.
Yep, great.
I think mine is the same as William's. My question, because I found your book very depressing. There's so many things that can go wrong, and I would say that the climate change is the major concern I have for the future of the world. And do you have any reason for optimism, or can you reassure us that we will solve these problems? Because I don't see them coming. I don't see the will in the world to solve those problems.
By the way, Bill Cole-Glaser is a former science and technology advisor to the Department of State, and Charlie has won the top medal in physical organic chemistry from the American Chemical Society. These are major figures in the scientific world. It's going to take quite a change in attitude. It's going to take quite a change in attitude in order to solve these problems. They're not easy. They're not, even after we make up our minds that we're going to deal with them, it's going to require some serious thinking. Some of the problems, there's been a lot of work on. If we decided day after tomorrow that we wanted to reach 1.5 or 2 degrees centigrade, there are plenty of people working out the scenario for how to do it. That's not the issue. The issue is to say, hey, this is really important. We've got to do it, and we've got to suck it up, whatever we have to do. Some of the issues haven't been worked out. The issues, the cyber attack business, is the issue of cyber arms control is analogous to the state of thinking about arms control. Say early 60s, when the question of how to inspect, how do we ensure, how to communicate was still an exciting intellectual endeavor. I'm mostly worried about nuclear. I think the nuclear is more important than climate change. That's a heterodox position, because it's going to take us 60 years to really get cooked with climate change. Nuclear could come out of the Ukraine crisis, which I'm not recommending. The basic thing is that if we wanted to solve them, we could. That's the most optimistic thing to say, that these things are still soluble. Whether they will be in 20 years, I don't know, but that if we made up our minds today, it would be possible to take care of just about all of them. That's the best thing I can say.
Great, thanks. Next up, we have Mike Nelson.
Chuck, thank you very much for this book and for
Hi,
doing
Mike.
this session. Really ambitious to cover so many topics. And I think some of my colleagues here at the Carnegie Endowment will be happy to hear you say that nuclear needs a lot more attention, since we have quite a team working on that.
Good.
But as you know, I'm mostly focused on the internet. And so my question is about how do we communicate what's really coming with the cloud and the cloud of things? And in particular, how do we get the message across to some of the people who are putting forward some really boneheaded proposals about regulating the internet and kind of trying to cordon it off, turn it into a splinter net where we have all these national networks. So my specific question is, do you have a least favorite term that is being used to describe the internet and tech policy in this area? And do you have a favorite phrase? When I was at Georgetown, I taught in the communication, culture, and technology program, and I found out that communication was a lot harder than technology, because often we get these words that get embedded in people's head, and with the word comes a really bad model. So my two examples are cyberspace, which implies that somehow this cloud, which is ever changing, is actually a spatial thing, and we can draw lines on it and have a national network and divide the world. And the other phrase I dislike is the tech Cold War, which is, I think, stupid for obvious reasons. But do you have any good words that we can use to counter the bad words that are out there and distorting tech policy? And you have to put it in a tweet, because policy is being made by tweets and headlines now,
That is a nice challenge. I don't think we're the major sinners in divvying up cyberspace. I think the big problem is the guys who want to use it as a means of control. And the Cold War is not a Cold War. I'm turning this over in my head because I haven't thought about what you said. You have to give me a few days, and I'll try and come back.
Well, you wrote a whole book, and I'm asking you for 7 words, so it's really unfair. But that's the way that things
longer
get
to write a
summarized,
short letter
right?
than a long one. Remember?
Yes.
In the beginning was the word.
And the word was cyber.
Mike Nelson is not someone to be toyed with. He did cyber policy for President Obama. He's now at the Carnegie Institute in charge of this kind of stuff.
No, you got that backwards. I did tech policy for Gore and for Clinton.
Ah, sorry. Okay.
And I helped Obama get elected. I was his representative in the first ever presidential Twitter debate, which was about tech policy in 2016. Bravissimo.
The issue isn't so much cyber when it comes to techno-authoritarianism. It's the whole idea of the cyber is a tool. So the issue is freedom. The issue is whether you use cyber for innovation, for allowing people to expand their ideas, to flower, to flourish, to try new things, or whether you use it to suppress. So I guess cyber suppression is as good a word for the negative.
Mhm.
The positive is cyber freedom. Is learning and having these fabulous resources of information, so you can study any obscure topic you want in no time and try some new idea. Having said that, there really is a privacy problem. There really is a problem of undermining the society by encouraging the formation of extremists who live in bubbles. And that is very tough, because you really want Facebook to be a censor? Well, if they're not, who's going to do it? So that is an issue which we really do need to confront. Whatever the sins of Facebook, they've got a point. You don't want government doing this. You want a private company doing this? I think the cyber community has to confront this question. That's the best I can do in a minute and a half.
Okay. Well, right now, while we speak, the House Energy and Commerce Committee is finishing up a hearing on that very topic about how to contain and control Facebook.
And your view is?
That the conversation is all in sound bites and tweets, and the lack of understanding among the congressmen is exceptional.
I believe that. Now,
Yeah.
how about the willingness of cyber enthusiasts to confront what's a real issue?
I think they understand they need to confront it, but they start by trying to educate people in what's really at stake. And I think you put your finger on it. It's control versus freedom. And it seems all parties really think this is a great technology for giving them control. And it's not what the internet was built on. It was built on a decentralization, a lot of innovation coming from all sorts of places. And I don't know. I think we're going to. I'm a technological optimist, but a political pessimist. I think we can address the global change issues with great new technology, unless we screw it up. And that's.
Well,
it's getting harder to stop the boneheaded proposals that are going to screw it up.
That's
Thank
true.
you very much. I'm going to let the other.
Well, I want to make another statement. A lot of the decisions that were made early on to basically ignore security issues and to ignore to ignore social media's effect on creating echo chambers are coming back to haunt us. And they were a product of the sort of devil may care attitude in the early days and the libertarian attitudes. And the folks who are rightly opposing what you describe as boneheaded ideas do have an obligation for confronting these issues.
Yeah, and you're right. You can't beat something with nothing. So you have to show how some of the new things that are being done can approach that. The biggest problem is we have a bunch of laws that stop competition. I mean, Facebook is calling for regulation that would actually make it almost impossible for anybody to compete with Facebook.
Well, this is standard.
And they're packaging it in a way that sounds really good to politicians.
This is a really, really important conversation. I don't think we're going to, I don't want to cut it off, but I want to make sure, Chuck, we get to everyone who wants to chime in. But let's come back to that if we have time at the end, because I think this is a great conversation to be having. I want to turn it over to Bill Bonvillian.
Thanks, Joanna. Look, first I wanted to say to Chuck that you've written an amazing book, Chuck. I mean, it really is a tour de force. The kind of depth you go into over the whole panoply of nightmares that the society and globe is facing is really quite remarkable. And it's so clear, written in such a clear-headed, kind of easy to absorb kind of way. And I just haven't seen this kind of approach in any kind of depth on single issues, much less taking on the entire group of issues. So a tremendous compliment to you on what you've accomplished here. It really is a remarkable precedent.
You're marvelous. Thank you, Bill.
No, it's absolutely true. The range is really startling. And then, look, let me just ask one kind of quick question, which, we've got a very, as you recognize, and you kind of state principles that ought to guide policymakers as they try to confront these issues. But we're gonna have, in addition to the principles, we're gonna need governance mechanisms. And as you pointed out, we began to work on some of those governance mechanisms in the course of the Cold War and the nuclear threat, but they're lacking in the rest of the territory. The beginnings in climate change, although a lot more to be done. But how are we going to put those governance principles together? How are we going to be persuasive to governments that they need to adopt, principles, not just principles, but organizing elements around these?
Well, it's hard to say which one goes first. I'm not an expert in these fields, but you've got to be clear on what you're trying to do and what the constraints are on what you're trying to do, broadly speaking. Otherwise, you're going to set up the wrong organization. So at the same time, you need to have some idea about how decisions are going to be made, who's going to make them, and by what criteria. I think that these two things are going to have to evolve simultaneously. I think the people who are thinking about behavioral norms should also ask themselves, well, okay, swell, who's going to make these decisions and how are they going to make them? And how are we not going to be paralyzed by having just too many cooks? My impression so far, and I've reviewed a number of these norms and codes of conduct and so on, is that they tend to stick to the platitudes. They tend to avoid the tough issues, and they also tend to avoid the issue that you're talking about, which is what is a proper mechanism for making these decisions? If you keep it, the way things are moving now, decision making is going to be increasingly decentralized. People, and the only constraint is going to be an agreed set of norms that there's certain things you just don't do. Now, that's a tough method. That's a tough system to run. You do a lot better if you had a proper regime with treaties and organizations and so on, the sort of thing that was set up after World War II. Lacking that, you better have principles that people agree to. Otherwise, you're going to have rogues and free riders and all kinds of things.
Great, thanks, Chuck. Over to Chris Wagner from STIA.
Yes, so I have a more philosophical question. You outlined there that big nexus between science, technology, and international affairs, and then you're projecting that there's some general approach. So I wonder if you could comment a little bit how that general approach can be applied in that really more and more diverse situation in which we live. So that time of the Cold War where there were two blocks and it was sort of clear how to negotiate that is sort of over. And it becomes a much more multi-polar world. So how do you see a general approach matching that great diversity that is sort of emerging?
Well, intellectually, I can see the approach. How ideally one addresses an issue. Institutionally and politically is yet another dimension. The intellectual approach, which is the dimension that I tried to address in the book, because that's something I can deal with. I'm not an expert on the institutional side. You have to ask yourself in a given situation, given everything, given the context, given the technology, the science, the state of science, how are things evolving now? If we just let them go, to the extent that we can predict what's going to happen, what's likely to happen, who's going to win, who's going to lose, are there going to be philosophical or ethical or other issues, security issues that we can readily foresee, that we can deal with them now? thinking of technology as an input variable that we can, and science, that we can at least influence, if not control. That we can sponsor research for a technology that we're going to need in several years. We can encourage the expansion of the expansion of a technology, the implementation. We can look for obstacles to a technology that looks like it's promising. We can add research on subjects to where we are ignorant, and we can be aware of the different external influences that affect the evolution of a technology, that affect the evolution of a situation in which technology is a major dimension. That's the intellectual side of things. And then, of course, we need to bring in accountability. We need to bring in monitoring. We need to as the thing evolves, we have to know we have to follow what we're doing, and we have to bring in things like precaution and avoiding risk and all of the other constraints. Now, how you incorporate this into a political system where there is a lot of resistance to the very idea of science, or even to the very idea of fact, that's where there are major powers of all worldwide that are basically nihilist. That's over my pay grade. It's all I could do to write the book.
Great, thanks. Over to Dr. Sokolow. Thanks for your patience.
Above your pay grade means the agenda of the next generation. Because they're not as encumbered as we are. So what I'm thinking about from this superb summary, by the way, Chuck, of this extraordinary book, is where does the field go next? What are the questions that maybe are just a little bit harder, but that we have to think about? And one is the big one, I think, is pushback. What's in the way? Incumbents, you mentioned, they're across the board. There are people with a vested interest in not making a change. You mentioned regulatory capture. Why do we accept regulatory capture across one field after another? There's, as you said, demotion of rationality and resistance to paternalism, which is often the paternalism of rational actors, which we're seeing in many areas. What can we actually research about that? There's envy, sometimes called environmental justice. And I'll be contrarian here and say a lot of it is saying we want what you have had across the international arena and so on, and catch up in a world which has limits is a tremendous pressure against those limits. Often this comes with extra costs and vague benefits. Certainly that's true of climate change. And then there's something called love of combat. People actually are tribal and they like to have enemies. And we haven't really deconstructed that as much as we need to say, when does that just too much, that particular love is just too much of an indulgence. On the optimistic side, technology innovation is your emphasis, but there is lifestyle change. I think the younger people are getting the feedback about how their parents are telling how their parents lived, how they have to live a little differently. Maybe that's not been proved to be true. As they get older, they imitate their parents after all. But I think that, and so that too should be, when does lifestyle change actually happen? Can it be productive? The thing that I've got to add is for scientists, the scientific community today is not the scientific community of the 1950s. It's of the 1950s. It's more ingrown. It's less influential. And we can't load as much on ourselves as I think we wish we could. There are tremendous values in the scientific community. The norms are shared across countries, and we work between Russian and American physicists, could in principle work with Chinese and American whoever's. But it's harder. And when they do get something understood among themselves, their governments aren't as anywhere near as inclined to listen, especially maybe ours. I think the Chinese scientists may have more influence in their government than we do in ours. But I don't know. Again, but there's insularity in the science community that leave us alone. I've read reports about the bio world that they really don't want the constraints on their, even a public inspection of what they're doing. The climate science community, tremendously insular, not welcoming, not going out and seeking, might be welcoming is the wrong word, but going out and seeking collaborations from other disciplines that could help move us along faster and understanding the planet. The science community itself is not your grandfathers or ourselves, our own grandfathers, science community. So then there's an agenda there of some sort to which many of us can add, many of you can add, that begins to be what does the next program look like? That is just off the axis of where we've been for so long. You've written a kind of the last book. I was told as a young man, a scientist should either write the first or the last book in any last item or book or paper in any field. Most of us can only write the first one. You've written the last one as well as the first ones over your career.
Chuck, any response and final words to wrap us up?
I don't know what I can add to Rob. Rob is professor of physics and a pioneer and a continuing contributor to environmental science in the broadest sense. So we've had the pleasure of the responses of some very high-powered and distinguished people today. Well, let me put it this way. One of the reasons I went to the trouble of learning all this stuff was the hope of bringing down some barriers. My sense is that young people are interested in looking at the overall picture of these major issues, that they're quite receptive to the idea that the world runs on technology, but it also runs on all of these other dimensions. I'm not sure that the educational establishment have responded fully to this to this push, to this desire on the part of the students. They have to make their own way through the disciplinary the disciplinary thicket of the university and of the media also. You can get actually quite good journalism that covers this nexus in specific areas. The coverage of the pandemic has been terrific. The coverage of climate is often extremely good. The global overview, I don't see so often. That's why I wrote this thing. That's why I wrote the book. The bull case is that, as you alluded to, Rob, is the hope for a tipping point, a social tipping point, not an environmental tipping point. I'm not in favor of the Antarctic glaciers coming and flooding us and doing in the thermohaline circulation. Think of how rapidly the public attitudes changed toward smoking, toward gay marriage, toward other major social issues. That's the hope, that given the pressure that comes from the young, who are going to bear the brunt of a lot of these changes, that there will be that kind of a flip, and people will say, hey, we really got to do something about this. It's complicated. Some of it we don't know how to do. Some of it we do know how to do. Let's get started with it. I don't have a better answer than that. And for everybody that didn't participate, you've heard some very smart people wrestling with some very tough questions today. And I thank all of you for this.
Thank you. And with apologies to Andreas and David for not getting to your questions, I encourage you to reach out to Chuck directly, as I'm sure he'll be happy to engage with you.
Weiss at georgetown.edu.
Great. Chuck, thank you so much for speaking with us all today. And thank you to this very distinguished audience for joining and sharing your thoughts and insights. Really much appreciated. And yes, we definitely look forward to the next book. We are quite sure this is not the last book from Chuck, right? Thanks, everybody.
I can take a break right now.
Okay. You can switch to the shorter, the journalistic pieces that you mentioned.
I'm going to write academic papers till I have another book length idea.
And if you don't have the book, again, the link, we put it in the text, or reach out to us, and we're happy to get it to you all. Thank you all so much for coming. And again, congratulations, Chuck.
And thank you, Joanna. And thanks to STIA.
Brett.